Network topology in UniFi network application is a very useful feature. In my previous video about LLDP, I already talked in details about how Ubiquiti supports LLDP in UniFi gateways and switches to display the beautiful tree structure. But when it comes to client devices in the network topology, situation becomes a little bit tricky, especially if you are talking about virtual machines within Proxmox. It will be even messier. In this video, let's talk through it. I run a Proxmox server. I'm going to use 4 of the physical parts for this video. And in the blue area, I have a lab environment. And then this green area is another environment. So basically, they are 2 standalone sites. Within the Proxmox, I run 4 virtual machines. I'm going to talk about 4 different scenarios using these 4 different connections. Let's understand without LLDPD in Proxmox, what will be the hierarchy, and if we install LLDPD, how the hierarchy will be changed. We will SSH into the virtual machines, the switches, and the Proxmox, so that we can understand how LLDP works, how the tree structure is constructed. Okay, let's get started. This is the lab environment and the screen layout that I'm going to use for this video. Let's first look into the network settings within Proxmox. In the Proxmox server, if I go to System, Network, you can see there are 6 physical parts or network devices for this particular server. This VMBR0 comes with standard installation and it uses the first physical part. And then I configured another 5 parts from part 1 to part 5. They use the remaining 5 physical parts respectively. So totally I have 6 physical parts and 6 Linux bridges. But in this video, I'm only going to cover 4 scenarios. So I'm only going to use the first 4 parts. Okay, then for example, let me show you the part 1, the first custom Linux bridge configuration. You can see it's simply using the second physical part, set it to VLAN aware. That's it. Very simple network device configuration within Proxmox. In this blue color UniFi lab environment, I have a Proxmox 24 switch. Its uplink switch is a aggregation switch. Furtherly, it's connected to a root switch. And then I have a separate lab environment. It has its own switches for sure. But these 2 sites, they are not connected. They are standalone. To achieve the 4 different scenarios for this video, I'm connecting the 4 parts of the Proxmox server in different way. For the management part, this VMBR0, I'm connecting it to this USW Proxmox 24. But for this part 1, which is the second physical part, is connected to the separate lab environment, not this blue lab environment. For the part 2, is connected to the same Proxmox 24 switch, just like the management part. You may think these 2, management part and part 2, will behave the same, right? No. The very last part, I connected to the uplink switch, not this Proxmox 24. So let's see how the hierarchy will be different when we show the network topology. Okay, later you will know to include client devices in the network topology. The MAC address is a crucial piece of information in the diagram. Just for your convenience, I also note down the MAC addresses. So the way I got this MAC addresses is, for example, for the right side for Linux virtual machines, I run IP link. For this first virtual machine, I can get this MAC address, then I note it down in the diagram. So in the same way, I got the 4 Linux virtual machines MAC addresses. And then for the Proxmox server, I go to shell, IP link. I got all the physical and Linux bridges MAC addresses. You can see, for example, this part 1, as I explained earlier, it used this physical part, right? So if you compare the physical parts MAC address and this Linux bridge MAC address, you will see they are identical. So that's why for each relationship, I note down a MAC address. I get it from this IP link command inside Proxmox. Okay, now we are ready to check the network topology. Standard Proxmox installation doesn't come with LLDPD. We can confirm that in the shell. Let me run psaux, try to find LLDPD. No, it's not running, right? Then in the right side, in the subtree from the network topology, you can see a interesting situation already. By the way, you see a very clean display. You see correct icons and very intuitive names. That's not because how Ubiquiti's client management works perfectly. No, it's just for this video to make it easier to understand. I went to each client device. In the settings, I force the description and icon. In a separate video, I had a lot of complaints about Ubiquiti's implementation, about device identification, but it's totally different story. You can see the system differentiate the Proxmox physical interfaces and the virtual machines. Why? Because from the diagram, you can see the virtual machines have different MAC addresses as the ports of the Proxmox. That's why from the UniFi switch perspective, they are different client devices. That's why they are displayed separately. Having said that, let's first look at the children of this Proxmox 24 switch. So we can see we have this children interface 0, which is due to this physical connection, right? And this interface 2 is due to this physical connection. Also makes sense. But let's see why the interface 3 is displayed in different hierarchy level. Interface 3, as shown in the diagram, is connected to the uplink switch. So it makes sense. This interface is correctly displayed as the child of the uplink switch, right? It's also correct. So far so good. Then let's check the 3 virtual machine icons. Because the first virtual machine is connected to the management part, yeah, it's displayed under this Proxmox 24, and then the virtual machine 3 is connected to the part 2. That's why it's displayed as a child of this switch. Also makes sense. Similarly, virtual machine 4, because it's connected to part 3, is displayed in the upper level. Also correct, right? But did you notice we are missing one pair? Yeah, we are missing the virtual machine 2 and the part 1. Why we don't even see them? Because they are connected to a totally separate site. What I'm displaying here is the network topology for this site A. It has zero knowledge of site B. That's why it has no way to display anything out of site B. That's why you have no way to see the virtual machine 2 and part 1. In the remaining part of the video, we are only going to look into the differences of the remaining 3 scenarios. For this second scenario, it's already clear. Keep in mind, what you are seeing now is the hierarchy you get when you do not have LLDPD installed in the Proxmox. Let me SSH to this Proxmox 24 switch to show you the LLDP information. Run CLI, then EN for enable. Then let me show LLDP neighbor. At this moment, the Proxmox 24 switch is only aware of one LLDP neighbor, which is the aggregation switch, and it is the uplink switch. That's why you see a very simple hierarchy. Under USW Proxmox 24, you don't see further levels. You only see a flat display of all the devices. If you are wondering how the system get this 4 clients information, how the system even know these 4 clients are under this switch, you can watch my previous video about LLDP. Basically, this is done by checking the MAC addresses in different switch level. For example, in this Proxmox 24, I can show MAC address table. Then you have all the MAC address information that this switch is aware of. And then by using this ports number, the system can know which client, which MAC address is directly under this switch. So that's why the system display and only display these 4 clients, even though at this moment for this lab environment there are many other MAC addresses, but only these 4 are displayed as children of this switch. Okay, this is how the system is working now without further LLDP information from these 4 clients. So now let's go to the next section of this video. Let me install LLDPD in the Proxmox. Let's see whether the hierarchy can have any changes. In the Proxmox server's shell, let me run regular Debian Linux command to install LLDPD. apt install LLDPD. Okay, it's installed. Then let me run systemctl enable now LLDPD. Then let's make sure it's really up and running. ps aux LLDPD. Yes, so then we are done with the installation. Give it some time till the hierarchy is refreshed. Okay, the network topology has been refreshed. Now you can see it's changed. Instead of a flat level for 4 devices, now we have 2 levels. Let me check the LLDP information inside the switch and inside the Proxmox server to see what happened. So first, let me check in the switch. Run command show LLDP neighbors. Okay, see, remember last time before installing LLDPD in Proxmox, we only had 1 entry here, which is the uplink UniFi switch. But now there are 2 new ones. The first one connect to the first part, the second one connect to the 6th part, and they have the exact same device ID but different part ID. Let's try to understand what's this device ID, what's this part ID. If you compare the left side slice, you can see DEFB is for the very first physical part, or this management part. That makes sense because this is the management part, right? So then if you look at the 2 different part ID values, you can see the first line is for this part, the second line is for this part. Both of them, VMBR0 and part 2, they are connected to the Proxmox 24 switch. So now we understand what are these new lines at all. So basically these 2 connections, these 2 blue links, they are represented as 2 neighbors. The 2 neighbors have the same device ID, different part ID, because they are from the same Proxmox server, but they are from 2 different physical parts, right? However, these 2 new lines doesn't explain why we have 2 levels of hierarchies. So then let's continue looking. Let's check the LLDP information inside the Proxmox server. So let me run LLDP CLI, then show neighbor. From this Proxmox server perspective, there are 3 LLDP neighbors. See what's the first one? The first one is the switch itself. It makes sense. The second one is also the switch. But the difference is, see the first one, the part ID is part 1, the second one, part 6, which means the first 2 neighbors exactly match what we see from the switch perspective, these 2 new neighbors, right? So then let's see what's the third neighbor. The third neighbor is USW aggregation switch. It corresponds to this part 3 because it's connected to the uplink switch. But this part is also from the same Proxmox server. That's why we have another neighbor. And another interesting thing is, see from the Proxmox server perspective, the terminology is more standard because it's called chassis ID. But in UniFi switch, it's called device ID. Okay, in the UniFi network controller from the hierarchy, if I click on this one, the interface 0, if you check the MAC address, you can see it ends with DEFB, which is both neighbors' chassis ID or the first neighbor's part ID. But if you check this one, interface 2, it ends with DEFD, which corresponds to the second line, the part ID. And this part ID belongs to this chassis ID. And this chassis ID is this particular device. So this relationship explains why visually unified network display these two different devices in hierarchy mode. I hope it's clear. Another thing in Proxmox, what you can run inside the LLDP CLI is to show the interface, show interfaces. Then you can see it lists all the interfaces, just like if we run IP link from the Linux level. So basically the LLDPD is active on all the interfaces. So then you may ask, okay, if that's the case, then why from the LLDP we only see 2 neighbors instead of 6 neighbors? That's because only 2 of the interfaces or ports are directly connected to this Proxmox switch. All other ports, they are connected to other switches or even other sites. Even though this LLDPD is working on all the interfaces from Proxmox server perspective, only 2 of them are listed as neighbors from the switch perspective. So now we are clear about the hierarchy display of these 2 ports, right? Now let's try to understand why these 2 Linux virtual machines are displayed in this way. So to understand that, we need to go to the switch to display the MAC address information for these 2 Linux machines. Let me run command show MAC address table, followed by the MAC address of these 2 Linux virtual machines. So let me first display this particular one, virtual machine 1. Okay. This is the MAC address information from the switch perspective. You can see it's connected to GI1. Let's check this particular one. This one is Linux virtual machine 3. Let me run the same command, but with the Linux virtual machine 3's MAC address. Okay, it's connected to GI6, a different part. If you compare the LLDP neighbor information, let me rerun the command. You can see for GI1 is for the management part, the VMBR0 part of the Proxmox server. So that's why this particular Linux virtual machine, which is this one, is displayed on the same level as this Proxmox part. But the other one has the same part as this neighbor, corresponds to this interface, the Proxmox part 2. So that's why this Linux machine is displayed on the same level as this Proxmox part. That's how the system decide how to display the Linux virtual machines in different levels of the hierarchy. Okay, we are good with this section. We successfully changed the hierarchy display by installing LLDPD. Before ending this video, let me do one more testing. So let me install LLDPD inside these 2 Linux virtual machines. Let's see whether it will have any impact to the hierarchy display or not. From this first Linux virtual machine, let me install LLDPD. Then from this virtual machine 3, let me do the same thing. Both are installed. Then let's give it some time to see whether the hierarchy will change. From the network topology perspective, nothing's changed. Let's see internally whether the LLDP information has any changes. Because we just installed LLDPD in the 2 Linux virtual machines, so let me check the LLDP information from there first. In the first Linux virtual machine, run LLDP CLI. Then show neighbor. It only shows one neighbor. It's the DEFB, which corresponds to the management part. This is for Linux virtual machine 1, which makes sense because it's connected to that management part, right? Then in the Linux virtual machine 3, do the same thing, LLDP CLI. Show neighbor, and the chassis ID is DEFB. Linux virtual machine 3's neighbor is not this part. Instead, it's this part. Then from the Proxmox server, let me run show neighbors. See, this time we have more neighbors. The first three are the ones we saw before. Then there are two new ones corresponding to these two Linux virtual machines. So this is from this Proxmox server and the two Linux virtual machine perspective. If you draw a topology purely based on this information, the hierarchy will look like these two Linux virtual machines will be children of this interface, right? It won't look like this. However, what you are seeing here, the network topology, is not based on the LLDPD inside the Proxmox server and inside the Linux virtual machine. Instead, it's based on the switch LLDP information and the MAC address information of the switch. So let me go back to the switch and show the LLDP neighbors. Nothing's changed. We only see the Proxmox as the neighbor. Then you may ask, okay, we installed LLDPD in Linux and the Proxmox did receive the LLDP information from the Linux. Why Proxmox didn't forward the LLDP information to the UniFi switch? Here it leads to an important concept. LLDPD never forward the LLDP packets to the so-called upstream LLDPD because there's no hierarchy for LLDPD at all. It simply maintains the neighbor information. So once the Proxmox LLDPD receives the Linux virtual machine information, it ends there. So the UniFi switch doesn't know the LLDP information from the Linux virtual machine. That's why the hierarchy doesn't change. That's why we still have the same hierarchy. Okay, I hope it's clear. Yeah, this ends the video. Thanks for watching.